thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's very exciting to be here and to share my experience and knowledge from more than 16 years in drug development. As you heard, I've been working in small businesses, big pharma, all the time in different development positions, mostly project management. So I've seen quite a lot from the late discovery stage through phase 1, phase 2, preparing for phase 3. My main competence is within preclinical toxicology, but in my being a part of project teams and heading up project teams, you learn quite a lot about all the areas that are important for drug development. So I've seen quite a lot of clinical, regulatory, chemistry and manufacturing, and market as well. And I will focus some of my speak here today about the market, the end of where we actually would like to see our product at the end. So to do that, we should start with, or I will start talking about the medical need and have a little discussion about what that actually is and how the customers, whoever they are, fits into this, and of course the regulators. I will touch upon that a little bit as well. And understanding the competition. You have already heard it's a crowded market out there. So all these aspects are very important to have an understanding of when you start forming and developing your target product profile, which I will come back and talk more to and explain what that is. And once that is done, you can do the project planning and execute on your plans. But to do that, you really need to know where you are heading. So it is that I will talk about today. How you ensure you have a strong idea of where you're going with your project and how your discoveries and your invention actually fits into that. Unmet medical need. What is that? And why do we talk about that? And when should we talk about that? And maybe the answer to the last question is the easiest to answer. It is now you should talk about it. You should talk about it and think about it from the beginning, even though that many of you, or most of you here, probably are very, very early in the value chain. You have done a lot of research, you have good ideas of what that might mean for developing new products for diabetes care. But I don't know what it's called in English, but my käpphäst is that it's not that easy. You need to think about this and you need to try to specify what you actually mean with unmet medical need. And then you have to link your discovery and your ideas to that need. And that will, of course, be some two-way communication, and it's somewhat iterative process. So you will adjust the need or the understanding of the need with your discovery and vice versa. So it is a closed system in a way. To illustrate that, I would like to show you this. Salad in a bag. It's a very low-tech example of where you have a need and you have a solution. I don't know when the need actually turned up, but I can certainly see the point in saving 1 minute in your cooking time by just taking the salad and put it in the bowl and eat it, instead of using 1 minute of chopping the salad, rinsing the salad, and so on. So someone was really smart to identify that need and then come with a solution. And that is actually what we're going to do with drug development as well. Here I choose this example because it's so simple, so it's very easy to understand what it's all about. Another example is this. It's a little bit more high-tech, smartphones. There's also a clear connection between a need of some sort. I would assume that all of you in here has a smartphone, otherwise you are a bit different. It's very common. And obviously most people think a smartphone is something that you really need. It's important to have this small computer in your pocket, and you can actually make phone calls on it as well. But some time point, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we didn't know that we had that need. But Steve Jobs had an idea of that it could be something that we should use. So this is also an example of where you should, even though that I will stand here today and say that you need to understand the market, you need to understand the needs out there, you also have to try to be a little bit visionary in your thinking. So this is an example of that. So now back to some more close to the heart of us. Another example of where there's a need and there is a product. Do you know what this is? It's a product called Oktober. It's inhaled insulin. It was on the market, I think it was more 10 years ago. It was launched by Pfizer, the biggest drug company in the world. But it seems that no one of you have ever heard about it, and that's not so strange because it's probably the lousiest product ever to be launched. And this, I think, serves as a good example of what we would like to avoid and why it's so important to do this analysis and evaluation of the medical need. There is probably a need for a product for people that need insulin but do not want to take injections. So they may have identified a need. But here the solution was probably not the best. And you don't need to have a lot of imagination to see that this is a really poor product. Who would like to bring this huge pot pipe to the dinner party and say, okay, I just need to take my insulin before we eat? Doesn't fly. There's a lot of other issues with this product as well that made it a very poor product and that didn't perform well on the market at all. But I think that it's a good example of where there's a mismatch between the need and the solution. All right, what is medical need then? Most of the time in a drug development business, you turn to the regulators and ask them, because they are the know-it-all. We hope that they have the answers to all the questions. How should we do things, and so on. And both FDA and the EMA have guidelines where they discuss definitions of unmet medical needs. But unfortunately, it doesn't really help us very much. You can see here where I highlighted in red text from the European guideline that says there is no single definition of what constitutes major public health interest or medical needs. They just state that it is important, but they also put all the responsibility on the sponsor. So you as the company need to explain why there is a big need that you are meeting with your product. So we don't really get help from them when we want to dig into this. And an example of that, it is important, but no answers, is that just a month ago there was a meeting between the European Medical Agency and the payer community in Europe where they discussed definitions and trying to find common ground on that. So we shouldn't dwell on that, but it points to that it is really important to understand this. Now to something more closer to what you do and diabetes. And we are going to look a little bit on type 1 diabetes. I choose to start there in type 1 diabetes because it's a little bit easier to find examples and discuss around this topic about medical need and how to define it and what it is that makes and how to reach a target product profile and develop your project plans. So back in the 1920s or before that, even when Banting and Best discovered and started to use insulin for treatment of type 1 diabetes, they really hit the head of the nail. And that was a real medical need, of course. Because before that, it was a death sentence to be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I used to show those pictures here of this young girl, where you literally can see the effect of insulin before and after. There's just a couple of months between those pictures. So before she was in really poor condition, and afterwards she looks like a quite normal young girl. So that was an unmet need that they really could address. But interestingly, already in the Nobel lecture that Banting held in 1923, he concluded that insulin is not a cure for diabetes. It is a treatment. So he already then pointed to that, well, there are still needs in this area. And then you can think about what has happened since then. And my answer is not very much. It is still insulin that we're using to treat type 1 diabetes. Yes, there are new forms of insulin. We have easier to use insulin pens, pumps, and all that. But in principle, it's the same thing that we're doing now that we did almost 100 years ago. So that in itself is of course an indication of that there is a need, and finding the cure is always the need, and that is, this goes also for cancer or Alzheimer or any kind of disease. But it's still kind of generic, and unfortunately it doesn't work very well, because if that was the only needs that we tried to solve or meet, we wouldn't have many drugs at all. So we need to work or think in a different way, and that is the way that the pharma and the healthcare business has worked all the time. We need to find others, call them temporary solutions if you like, where we're treating and improving the treatments all the time. Another way of describing needs are by putting numbers, and you can choose whichever number you like, more or less. So I picked those numbers. 6.18 million people in the 8 major markets has type 1 diabetes. So that says something about how big the need is in how many people out there that might need an improved treatment. But maybe not all of them needs a new improved treatment, but at least it says that there is a lot of people out there. There are 542,000 children below 14 years of age in 2015 with a disease. So yeah, that's another number. But another important number is, of course, that the life expectancy of people with type 1 diabetes is 10 to 15 years shorter than the normal healthy population. But again, it really doesn't help us in defining what it is, what kind of need we are going to address. We know in general terms there are needs there. So now I would like to turn to an example to illustrate how you can approach this and trying to be a little bit more specific on this. So here is a modification of the disease progression that was presented by Eisenbart in 1986, where you have the beta cell mass, beta cell function on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And at some time point something happens that results in that you are forming autoantibodies and you have an attack, an immune attack on the beta cells. But in the beginning you will not notice anything and you are living quite normal life, and you know all that. So, but at some time point you will have a quite acute onset with a rapid decline in the beta cell function, and that's when you are diagnosed. So let's now assume that we have an idea of a treatment that we can start at that time that will stop the immune response and stop the degradation of the beta cells. That is partly a hypothetical example, but it's also actually a real example, because it has been tried many times, And I happen to know about a quite big phase 2 trial that is running right now with this as the goal, to stop the beta cell degradation. So that is, of course, one way to say, okay, now if we can stop the degradation there, that we have a chance to let the people with diabetes to have a longer honeymoon period, a period where they maybe not need to be very much, or don't need to use insulin. Can we extend such a period for a couple of years? It may be worth something. That is an idea that we can at least try and evaluate a little bit further. So it all starts now. I have, as you hear, I've moved to the other end. I talked a lot about what is medical need, and now I'm going back to the science where you probably are, and you have those ideas of what can we do and with the discovery that we have. And so this is an example. So what we have done now is, but this is actually one thing that is important to consider early on as well. That is that we have identified a subpopulation, because we know that you saw that was more than 6 million people in the 8 major markets with the disease, but not all of them are newly diagnosed. So what I did here in my example was to say that we should target the newly diagnosed segment. So I have already now identified a subpopulation. A subpopulation could of course be defined in many ways. Here it's the timing, you could say, but it could also be on genetic profile, comorbidity profile. It could be anything actually that makes sense from your from the scientific perspective. So if you have a mechanism of action that is targeting a specific subpopulation, then that's of course your subpopulation. But this is an important thing to keep in mind when you reach out to future investors and partners, because this will of course have an impact on what kind of market you are looking into, both in the size but also in the way you can create a need in a specific market. So this is an important thing for you to consider. Another thing that is very interesting and important when you're talking about medical need is to try to look at it from different perspectives. Basically, there are 4 perspectives. We can start with the patient, and we should not forget the patient, because they are the real end users. They are the ones that we would like to help. But I can say that historically, the patient may have been a bit forgotten. It has been more interesting for pharma companies to see the doctor as the real customer, because they were at least the decision maker some years ago. Now it's changing, definitely changing, which is good, but that it means that you need to have that take in patient perspective a little bit more, even early in the development. So patient, and of course doctors are still there, so we need to think about what is it that doctors would see as a need, and what would they think is important to address in your development. Regulatory authorities, they still have a say, so we need to find out what they are thinking. And payers. The pharma business and the pharma market, the healthcare business, is a different market compared to salad in a bag market, because you have end user and you have strong advisors, the doctors, and you have someone else paying for it. So there are 3 parties that need to agree in some way in order for deciding to buy a product. That is a challenge, but it also makes it very interesting. I have spent a lot of time meeting patient organization and trying to work with patient organization and understanding the patient perspective. And that has been extremely rewarding and very emotional actually, to meet those people and discuss what is it that they ask, what is it that they need, if we're talking about type 1 diabetes specifically, what is it that affects their life, and what is it that they would like to see in the future? Of course, there are individual variations, but it comes out very clearly in those discussions with the representatives for various patient organizations that the burden of the treatment is actually something that is quite heavy, and specifically the fear of hypoglycemia is what is bothering the most. So this tells me quite clearly that we cannot come up with a new drug that forgets about the risk for hypos, for example. We need to have something that at least not makes the risk worse, and preferably even reduce the risk of hypoglycemia. So that is quite clear. Whatever you do, you need to have that in mind, and you need to investigate that in a good way so that you can actually prove or demonstrate that you have a positive effect on the risk of hypoglycemia. I could spend hours talking about this. Now I'm very lucky. I'm not a type 1 diabetes patient, and I don't have any relative. Well, I do have one relative with type 1 diabetes, but I know that it is a very heavy burden to live with this. So I think this perspective, especially in type 1 diabetes or in diabetes in general, is very important to keep in mind. So this we should bring with us, so keep this now in your mind. Quick look at the doctor's perspective. The doctor would always look for the efficacy and the effect. So of course we need to find out what is it that makes sense for a doctor. Why would a doctor prescribe a new drug? He or she needs to know or be convinced that it actually works. So it's kind of a given that if we're testing a new mechanism of action with a specific claim that it will save beta cells, we need to show that it actually does that. But now remember that it's maybe more for the doctor than for the patient. I did not mention that when it came to the patient, because they really doesn't care what the drug does as long as it helps. But we need to show something for the doctors. And also the doctors of course care for the welfare of the patient here and now, but they also, I would assume, and that's the impression I get, is that they have a little bit more longer perspective of things. So for them it is very important to have an impact and reduce the blood glucose levels. So we are talking about diabetes, so that is kind of a given as well. But we need to prove that we have a good effect on glucose levels, because we know that is very well correlating to the long-term complications. And that is what we would like to avoid at the end, the long-term complications. Regulators, they have a little bit the same perspective. They would like to see the efficacy. They will never approve a drug that has no demonstrated efficacy. But you do not need to be superior to any other drug. You can actually approve generic drugs, which means that they are just as good as the original. So it's not necessary to make something better. But if you come with a new drug, with a new mechanism of action, you need to have something extra, something new. So that is what the regulators would look for as well. They also have a very strong focus on the safety of the drug. So at the end, it is the benefit-risk balance that they are looking at. And the regulators also look at the quality, so the manufacturing part. Can you manufacture this drug reproducibly? Do you have control over all the steps in the production? Will it be safe to use? And there are no batch-to-batch variations, or all of a sudden you have some impurity in the drug that wasn't there from the beginning, and all those aspects are very important, which you very often forget about in the beginning of drug development. But I think it's important for you to understand that this is something that will be a lot of focus on later in the development. Now I'm going into an area where I admit that this is not my strongest area, but I just want to mention the payers. And the payers are different people, different organizations depending on where you are in the world. In Europe, we have most of the healthcare being funded by the governments, so it's public funding. In the US, you have the insurance companies and all that. But at the end, they are all interested in more or less the same thing. They would like to save expenses. So you really need to have something much better than what's out there if you are going to take a high price, basically. But you can, if you can show and demonstrate that you have improved the quality of life for patients significantly compared to the standard of care, you can probably also get a quite high price. But this is so complicated, so difficult to do in my mind. Or I have very little experience, hands-on experience of this, so I would not dwell on this very much, but I would like to point to the importance of think about this early on and maybe finding someone that can help you with this. And I know there are some good health economists in Lund that you, for example, could have a discussion around just to validate your idea and your target profile when we get that far, to see if could you use that to investigate and demonstrate the relevant endpoints that the payers would look for. So just to summarize, patients would like to see no hypos, less treatment burden. The doctors are looking for the glucose control. The regulators are most interested in the benefit risk and product safety, while the payers are interested in the money and the cost effectiveness. Those perspectives need to be taken into to the continued work. When you have an understanding on what is it that we looking at in terms of need, you also need to look at what's out there that's already there. And type 1 diabetes, I've already said it's insulin. That is the standard of care. It can be in vials, it could be in pens, it could be in pumps, and I couldn't resist to put in that nice picture of one of the first attempts to make an insulin pump. I think it was also very good for your exercise. It was a good training carrying around that pump. But different variants of insulin and ways of administer insulin, that's what you're doing right now. There is up in the corner a little small other drug. It's actually an amylin analog. I don't know if it's marketed in Europe actually, but it's out there in the US, but it's very seldom used because it's just not a good product. I think it's actually increase risk for hypoglycemia and really doesn't add much. But it's another drug out there, but that is not really a competitor to compare to. It's insulin that you are using. This is very important to understand, and we will soon come back and talk a little bit more about type 2 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, it's very easy to relate to what's the competition, what is the standard of care. But you should also look into the future and try to understand what's coming when you are evaluating the needs. Maybe there is someone that has already come very far in solving the problem that you would like to solve. So you need to try to look into that as well. There are right now attempts to maybe use GLP-1 receptor analogs, agonists also for type 1 diabetes. There are studies ongoing with SGLT2 inhibitors. I don't know how big impact that will have, but it's interesting to note that they are actually trying to do something there. There will be more advanced pump systems. So up in the corner there, you will see a dual pump, fully automatic. So you will just load it with insulin and maybe another hormone. Could be glucagon, and you will have both the speed and the brake, and you will have a very good way of controlling your blood glucose. That is probably coming to the market within a couple of years. At least the first versions of those pumps are very close to market. The problem is that glucagon is not yet there yet, but that's another story. And also in the future, there is a lot of research going on, and I guess you know that better than I do, that replacing beta cells in some way. And if that can be solved, you can actually say, I would claim that that is the cure for the disease. So you need to keep in mind also what's coming when you are trying to figure out how you define the medical need and how that fits with your discovery that you would need to or want to develop. So it started out with the question about unmet medical need, and I have now pointed to the different perspectives that you can use when you try to analyze and understand what the medical need actually is for you and for your where you can place your innovation and your discovery. I am aware of that this is not the answer of anything, is quite generic, even though I try to use an example. And I will continue to use that example in a minute when we go into talking about the target product profile. But before you do that, you need to straighten out this question mark and make that to an exclamation mark, so you have at least a first idea of a relatively specific aspiration, if I may put it that way. So it's not enough to say, well, I would like to develop a new diabetes drug. That is not specific enough. So you need to be a little bit more for whom, when in the disease progression, all those kind of questions. And is there a subpopulation? What kind of needs from different perspective do I want to address? So when you have that idea, then you can start to become more tangible in your targets. So now it's time for you to make that first target product profile. A target product profile, I actually believe that is something that have been driven by the FDA, but I've seen thousands of different versions. But the general idea is very, very simple. It is to make a list of targets or claims that you would like to demonstrate. And it's the target product profile, so it means it is for the drug that you are going to put on the market in 10, 15 years ago. So of course it's not an easy task, but it's worthwhile doing it. And you should do that as early as possible. But it will help you a lot, I promise. So let's start. It can look like this. Now we're doing the same example for this new type 1 diabetes drug where we stop the progression of beta cell death. We said in the indication and usage, we said it was newly diagnosed. And here I also say it has to, the population needs to be more older than 18 years. And then you say, well, this is a children's disease, so why are you doing that? And that is because there are still adults that are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and you will have it will be difficult to develop a drug for children before you have data in adults anyway, for regulatory reasons. I also say that we need to have a C-peptide positive population, because C-peptide positive means that they still have some beta cell function left, and that is what we want to save. So that is also, now here we are narrowing in the population. And I also think it will be very difficult to do this without, we cannot take away insulin. the patients need insulin. So it's an add-on to insulin that we are going to develop. So that's the first take. Maybe we'll find out something on the way when we develop later that can change this, but now we have a starting point. We also want to make a convenient product, and the most convenient product we can think of is an oral tablet that you take once daily. So that is also an important target. Efficacy, that was important. Of course, we need to show that it works. And I think we need to keep to what is the standard in diabetes and demonstrate an effect on HbA1c, so the long-term glucose levels. And we need to show a reduction. And here I've said it should be more than 0.4% compared to placebo. And that is a regulatory requirement. That is the level of reduction in A1C that they will see as meaningful reduction. So that's another point that you need to consider. And the more you can be specific on exactly what you want to demonstrate here, the better it is. So therefore, you should try to do that. And I know for a scientist, it might be a little bit difficult to do this because they say we have no data yet, so we don't know. But then I say that is not the point. The point is to define a target that you will aim against. And then you will get the data to show that you actually can meet those targets. And if you already now know that there's no chance with your new innovation that you can meet those targets that you have defined, then you should really think if it's worthwhile keeping on with the project. So this is a way of validating your project idea. And that is what the investors will try to do when you present it, and future partners. This is exactly the way they will look at the project. I also throw in a secondary important endpoint here, and that is to show that the glucose excursions will be there will be less excursion, so there will be a more flatter profile. I think that sounds good. So, so just to show that you can also add different endpoints here, but it can only be one primary endpoint, of course. We need to show something on the pharmacology part. We wish to have a product with a relatively high oral bioavailability, because that is also good for many reasons, for variability, day-to-day variation, and so on. So it's a little bit technical, you could say. Then we also need to show that the C-peptide levels are unchanged over time. If that is an efficacy endpoint, or if that is a mechanistic pharmacology endpoint, that can be discussed, but it should be somewhere here at least. And we also need a drug that has no food interaction. Now, why do I say that? Again, it's for convenience reasons, because if you have food interaction, you need to have instructions when to take the drug, and maybe you will have a drug that says that you have to take it 30 minutes before you eat or 2 hours after, and that will not work. It's very difficult. Try to do that sometime. Try to take a drug with those restrictions, and you will find out it's very difficult to do it. So therefore, yeah, you should try to have those specifications early on, because that would of course affect the way you design the molecule you will work with and your lead compound. Safety is also important to address. Here I've just proposed that we should reduce the hypoglycemia risk with more than 50%. And then you can discuss, is that severe hypo? Is it nocturnal hypos? What type of hypoglycemia is it? Yeah, we should think about that as well, but that's also a whole day discussion, I think. And then we want a drug that is generally safe and tolerable. It's difficult to be more specific early on, but if you are working in a indication or a drug class where you know there are some issues, and here we have pointed to the hypoglycemia, for example, you can be more specific. Maybe there is something else that you would like to say. We wish to be better than this and that, because we know that is a class effect, and so on. And then at the end, as I said, this is the tricky part, but it's good to think about what could, from a health economy point of view, also be included in your TPP upfront. Here I said that we would like to demonstrate that the patients are insulin free for more than 1 year. Insulin is not expensive, so maybe it's not so much about the money, but it is, you could say, also a way of demonstrating, or objectively demonstrating, at least a change in the quality of life. Because if you don't need to take your insulin, you don't probably need to so often check your blood glucose levels, and maybe you do not need to count carbs and all that the patient need to do otherwise. So that would be a very good way of indirectly demonstrate an improved quality of life. And then also think about how could we demonstrate an overall decrease in healthcare costs. And then that's when you are going to talk with health economists. How do you do that? Well, so I can do like this. So the yellow boxes here just to indicate that I have now actually taken all the aspects into account, all the perspectives into account in my TPP. The first one, indication and usage, that's based on the mechanism of action and also where the competition is, and well, all sorts of population definitions. The drug form is for the patients. We wanted a convenient drug form. Otherwise, you may end up with an Exubera thing again. It worked, but no one really wants to use this huge device. The efficacy, as I said, it's for the doctors and the regulators. They need to see that we actually have a drug that works. They need to trust that. As well, the pharmacology part is also for the doctors and the regulators, but a little bit for the patients, because I mentioned the no food interaction, which is more of a convenience thing than anything else. Safety, of course, for the patients, they need something that is safe, but doctors and regulators are interested in that. And health economy, there both the patients and the payers' perspectives comes in. This is somewhat arbitrary, taken out of thin air, but I think it serves as a good example of how you could work with this. Now, this is for the final product, the product you want to put on the market 10 years, 15 years from now. And you will never, few of you will be there all the way from now until the market. If you are starting up a company, you are probably thinking about having an exit at some time point, and selling it to a big pharma company, and they can take it the rest of the way. To do that, I think you still need to have an idea of where you're going, or where it's possible to go. But this will also help you to define your exits. So use that same TPP to define, okay, how far can I take those different parameters when I exit, and what do I think is necessary to demonstrate to show that it's, well, we have reduced risks in a project, and we have at least indicated it's possible to meet the requirements of the final TPP. So I will not go into the details, but just as an example, you could say that the drug form, it's probably takes a lot of money, a lot of time to develop a final tablet product. But for you to demonstrate the efficacy, it's not necessary to have the tablet. You can do it with a solution or something else. So that's fine. But then you can spend some time on making a prototype tablet to show, well, this drug that I have developed, this compound can be made in a tablet with a suitable strength. Not a final product, but at least you have proven that can be done. And the same goes for, maybe that's the best example. Of course, if we have in the primary endpoint, we would like to demonstrate an effect on A1C over 2 years. You will never do that in phase 2, so you need to do that over a shorter term. So here, maybe 6 months or even 3 months will be sufficient. I say 6 months because I think that is even a bit too short, to be honest. If you have beta cell preservation as your mechanism, you probably need to go for 1 year, but this is an example, just to show how you can work with this. So I find this very useful to spend a lot of time to discuss where are you heading, what's your aspiration, how can that be translated into a TPP, and then how do I use that in order to set my goals on a shorter term. Being it exit, or maybe it's just to bring you to the next decision point in your project, but everything needs to point in the same direction. Now to the really tricky part. And I didn't say it was tricky, I said it was different with type 2 diabetes. And I have tried to avoid this as much as possible because it is so complex. And to the left you see the recommendations from ADA, the American Diabetes Association, and I think the European guidance is more or less the same about how to treat type 2 diabetes. You always start with diet and exercise. Then does it work, you go for metformin. That's easy, but then you add layers of new OADs and you can vary them different ways. So it is a very crowded, very complex market to enter if you're going for a new drug. So there is certainly not enough to say, well, I have a new drug for type 2 diabetes. You need to be more specific. You need to find your population. Maybe that is the most important part, to find a subpopulation or that can be addressed with your new discovery. So excuse me, to the right, I put in a table that I took from a report from one of the bigger market research companies called Global Data. Here they have summarized, based on interviews with key opinion leaders, what they see as the biggest needs, but still a little bit generic. But they point to the disease-modifying treatments that provide sustained glycemic control. That is the biggest need in this market. Then I have tried to figure out what does that actually mean. But it sounds to me it's against something like curing the diabetes, or at least a very close step to come much closer to that. But that is a relatively high importance, and there is not much going on in that area. That's the way you should interpret the current level of attainment as a number one. And then there are drugs with non-glycemic benefits. I would assume that is drugs that have a good effect on cardiovascular safety, for example. And I mention that because this report is from 2015, and that was before the data started to come out that demonstrated that GLP-1 receptor agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors has a positive effect on the cardiovascular risk. So I think this table would probably look a little bit different now. So there a big need at least has been addressed, probably in a quite efficient way. Yeah, and you can see there are drugs with improved side effect profiles, increased patient compliance, and I think that the last one is also an important thing to keep in mind, especially in type 2 diabetes. With this jungle of options when it comes to choosing drugs, it's a bit strange that there are still a lot of people out there that are not in good control, you may think. And one of the issues is compliance. People, I wouldn't say patient, people in general very seldom do what they are supposed to do. So therefore taking your drug when it's supposed to be taken and all that, and not at least exercising and eating what you are supposed to eat, that's difficult for people. So therefore finding ways to help people to take their drugs and live a healthy life is probably more important now than it was a couple of years ago or 5 years ago. And I know from my last year at Novo Nordisk that it became more and more important to focus on that, and shifting the perspective of the entire pharma business from being a drug manufacturer, drug seller, to becoming more of a healthcare provider, or providing complete solutions for the patients. So I think that is an area where a lot will happen, which not necessarily mean that there needs to be new drugs, but it could be all those different apps for your smartphone that can be used to support you as a diabetes patient and so on. That's just one simple example. So what I've shown you now, and the thinking around medical need and the perspectives on that takes a lot of time, and it's based on my experience working with this many years. So I will also point you to a shortcut. I've already mentioned the market reports and market outlook reports. They are a quick way to get a better understanding of the needs in the market. Unfortunately, you have to pay for them. So, but I know that maybe you can ask Annie. She can help you with that. But that is a good way to at least start that process and get a first indication. Then you will find those tables with much more text describing what it is, and I find them quite useful, at least in the beginning. And then you need to do some work yourself on trying to figure out how does my innovation fit into this, and what can we do, and what should we emphasize, and so on. And the general idea is, of course, that to do the right thing, to get to the goal, to place a drug on the market, you need to know, when you have your idea, you need to know, you need to feed in some information from the end in order to refine your idea and then work your way towards the market. So that's the way it's an iterative process, and it's a circular. And of course, you do not do this only once. You do it now, and then you do it again and again and again, because you will have new information. You will run studies, you will get data, something changes in the diabetes treatment guidelines. There is all of a sudden someone has shown that a new drug has a very good effect on the risk for retinopathy, for example. So there will always happen things in the market that you should be aware of. It is a very tall order for a researcher, for a small company. And the big pharma companies have huge departments working with this all the time. So, of course, you cannot do the work. But I think it's important to just be aware of that this is how your future partners, how the investors will think. And it will also help you to design your development programs in a good way. So it will all help you to do the right thing. Thank you very much.